He was born in Lebanon. No one really knows the exact date, somewhere between 1893 and 1897. There's a date on his death certificate, probably the most correct. I forget at the moment what it is, but there's some earlier dates on some of his other records. Anyway, he grew up as a teenager in Lebanon prior to World War I. And by the time he became, say, of military age, mid-teens, the Turks began to conquer all of Asia Minor. So they conquered Armenia, Lebanon, Syria, and they were expanding their empire south. They were allied with the Germans, who were getting ready to start a war in Europe. What the Turks' tactic was to take teenage kids, men, from cities they conquered and put them in Turkish uniforms and with unloaded rifles, put them in front of the Turkish troops advancing against the next city, and then these Lebanese boys would absorb enemy fire while the Turks behind them would shoot down the defenders of the city. So it was a very brutal but effective tactic. As a result, a great many teenage boys from Lebanon fled the country. So Dad fled the country, or my dad fled the country when he was about 17, I guess. Went at first to Egypt, and then with some of his friends came to New York City. He tells me the story that when he arrived in New York City, he had a summer shirt on and a straw hat, and the first time he ever saw a really bitter cold, so he must have come in the winter, and he just about froze to death in New York City being transported about. He came to Ellis Island, and Nancy has a plaque with his name erected at Ellis Island, and I have a photograph of that plaque. I'll probably show that next. That's probably the next thing to show. And anyway, he traveled around in the United States, went to Fond du Lac, Wisconsin for a while. There's a fairly large Lebanese population all over the United States because of this exodus from Lebanon. He finally wound up in Cleveland, Ohio, with his blood aunt, who we call Aunt Anna, with his half-sister or some close relative, Adele, and her husband, Uncle Esper, and several, like 5 or 6 other lifelong friends, Jim Joseph, gee, I forget their names now, Uncle Tom, who was my godparent, and John Acid's father, or John Salem's father, who's Betty's father-in-law. And they stayed together and played cards for a long time, and, until they finally died. He came to the United States in 1914 and fought in the war, in World War I early. He fought in France. I found out from his draft records that he only was in the Army for 8 months. He went to basic training, went to France, got wounded, the war was over, and he came back. He had the tip of one of his ears shot off, so he had a flat top on one of his ears, and he had machine gun wounds in each of his legs. Fortunately, they missed the bone, but you could see the scar beside the shin bone on each leg. He was trained at Fort Niagara in New York, and I think that's one near Niagara Falls. So anyway, that's some of the early detail about Dad. He had already learned how to be a barber. In Lebanon, barbers were like shoeshine boys. They just walked around with their tools on the street and just solicit people to see if they wanted haircuts. So he knew how to cut hair. When he came to Cleveland, he worked for Chevrolet company, I think, or Fisher Body plant, doing something with painting cars or something like that. And he really didn't like working for someone else. People were sort of picking on him because he was Arab. And I think he really wanted to be more independent. So he quit that job and started a barber shop. I think he worked with someone else to begin with and finally became the owner of his own barber shop. He never had any training in the United States to be a barber. He just had learned it in the old country. But he became a good barber, and he remained a barber all his life. Dad met Mom when he was a barber, and Mom came from a disrupted family. Her mother and sister left the father, Fred Jeffers, in Michigan and never went back again. And the sister married Carl Keeney, and Mom and Dad became friends. They were both lonely, and they became more and more friendly. Mom worked for a while as a beautician, like in Dad's barber shop, and at that time women had very long hair. Mom's hair went down to her waist, and then when the hairstyle changed in the 20s, when women got shorter hair, Dad cut off her hair to shoulder height instead of waist height, and Mom, I think, sold her hair for wig making. So it changed the appearance of Mom quite a bit. And Mom and Dad fell in love, and eventually they got married. I remember the barbershop, the layout of the barbershop, because my dad had that barbershop until our family broke up, and I used to spend a lot of time in the barbershop. I got to know it so well when I was in the orphanage thinking about it that I could probably today sit down and draw a floor plan of that barbershop. One time I was foolish enough to stick my finger into an empty light socket, and the electrical jolt threw me down on the floor, so I'm lucky I didn't get electrocuted. So I'm looking for 12547 where Dad's barbershop was, and you can see it's all gone. All the buildings are gone here. So his barbershop was along here, but this is all down. This is the house I was born in. It's on Arcade Avenue. The address is 16124. I was lucky to see that address on my birth certificate, on the old one, because the new birth certificate doesn't show it. So that's where I was born. My mom and dad lived in that house for about a year. I was born at University Hospital on St. Adelbert by University Circle. It's easy to get to. It's right across from Severance Hall, and it's right next to Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital. We lived on East 124th Street until around 1938. So all five of us, well, I was born on Arcade, but the other four were born when the family lived at East 124th Street. Some man came by with a pony and took photographs of Betty and myself. Of course, this is later, but we lived at East 124th Street for quite a few years. As I remember Larry being born, because I have a recollection that there was only Mom and Dad, myself, and Betty in the house, and somebody came to visit. Mom was in the bedroom, and when that person left, all of a sudden there was another person in the house. So I may be wrong, but I think Larry was born at home. I remember another time going to Euclid Beach with my parents, and as we left, coming down that aisle that's so familiar in my memory as you go towards the exit door, I caught a baby sparrow. First time I ever caught a baby bird. And I took the sparrow home, and we lived upstairs above the barber shop, so we had a staircase, of a flight of stairs and then a landing, then another flight of stairs, and then you entered the house, and then the kitchen was right at the head of the steps, and then there was a window looking outside. It was, I said it was a wooden building, but it was a brick building, but a wooden facade down by the barber shops, and on that one side that was the backdrop for some of our photographs. There was a brick ledge by the kitchen window that was about 3 feet deep, and I set the baby bird out there on that ledge and tried to feed him. And of course he died, but that was a very big thrill for me to be able to raise a baby bird. It's probably where I started to get my interest in animals. I remember another time, I don't know what happened, but I tripped and fell on top of a big giant wash pail. It looks like a galvanized wash pail, but it was very wide, probably held about 15 gallons. And I cut my ear against the edge of the pail, and my dad took me to University Hospital to take care of my ear, and I still have a little notch on my ear because of that. I remember my dad taking my mother and I down to this lake, this little island in the center of it, and there used to be a house right there where that cement work is. That house was still standing when I was going to John Carroll University, driving past us all the time, and you could rent canoes. And I remember my dad taking me and my mom out in a canoe ride, and we just rode around the lake. I actually remember being over on this side of the lake in the canoe. I see there's people fishing here now. So there was a time early in the marriage of my dad and my mom when things were going pretty good. You know, they just had maybe 2 children at that time. I'm beginning to think that Mom got overwhelmed with 5 children in 10 years, and then another one that was miscarried. She could have got overwhelmed with too many children to care for, and a husband that didn't understand her. But anyway, this was in the better times when we used to drive out to the west side and look at the rich homes, and when we used to come down here in the lagoon. And I know my dad told me at the art museum, which is very close to here, during the Depression, people were allowed to fish for carp in there. I don't know if my dad did, because he always had an employment as a barber. He never really got destitute during the Depression. This is the entrance to Cleveland Clinic Children's Hospital for Rehabilitation on 2801 East Boulevard. And that's what used to be Health Hill Fresh Air Camp. I spent a few months there in the summer of 1937, I think it was. I don't know how old these buildings are, but these might be the buildings that I stayed in. This is it, though, Health Hill Fresh Air Camp. I really enjoyed staying here. I didn't gain any weight, but I told my parents when I came home that I was able to learn how to swallow pills and take medicine. So right away they gave me some pills I was supposed to take, and I was unable to take them. So I guess when I was young I had a problem taking pills. There's the library. There's a side entrance and the main entrance. This building was standing when I came out here. It's the Rice Branch. I think the address is 2801 East 116th Street. And I think I went in that door, because I don't see a door in the front, but undoubtedly it's been remodeled since I've been in it. I'm not going to go in it, but this is it. This was the library of my dreams when I was a young kid. So this area right here is where the building was, where my dad's barber shop was, and where our home was. And I can see down the street on 124th, they replaced those apartment buildings too. But after 1408, we moved to 1502. And when we first moved into 1502, now this might have been in 1939, or maybe even possibly 1940. But it was in the spring, because I remembered all those caterpillars. I don't think we lived long at 1502 Lakeview, but probably through mild weather where I pulled Larry on a wagon, and snowy weather where I pulled him on a sled, because I think I remember pulling him on both the wagon and the sled around the block. That white building in the background, still standing, that was Star Bakery. And that's on Lakeview Avenue, so 5201 was right behind that corner. Here's the sidewalk, if you can see it, where I used to come pulling Larry on a sled and a wagon. We moved further north on Lakeview to 1368, just north of Beulah and just south of Superior. And that's the house Mom left when she left. And when she left, I knew she was leaving. I don't know how I knew it, and so we talked about it. I set a rendezvous point where we could meet at a mailbox that's on the corner of 123rd and Lakeview. We'll say the corner of Lakeview and Superior. I also remember my mother, when we lived at this house, of borrowing a Bible from a salesperson, and she was going to look at the Bible and decide whether she's going to buy it, and I guess they didn't have money to buy it, so she tried to copy it down, and she copied down part of it, and the person came back, and then she had to return the Bible. So that made an impression on me. I never forgot that. I remember another time, the only time in my life that I don't ever remember dreaming when I was asleep. I remember laying in bed, looking out the door, seeing my mother and father playing cards on the kitchen table. It was like I blinked my eyes, I opened my eyes again, and they're still at the kitchen table. But then I gradually realized it's not night anymore, it's daytime, and the sunlight shining through the window shades. It was such a very unusual experience to just spend the entire night without recalling having any dreams. That's the only time in my life that happened. I remember one time I slept with my dad in a different bed, and I wet the bed, but the water went on my dad's side, so my mother blamed my dad for wetting the bed. And I was too much of a coward to own up that undoubtedly I did it, so he took the rap for me wetting the bed. I remember being very fascinated with fire. I was playing with fire in front of a old-fashioned pot-bellied stove like. Larry was there as a young child, and somehow I set Larry's clothing on fire. So my mother had to put the fire out, and Larry didn't get hurt at all. I remember my dad taking us for rides in his car from East 124th and Auburndale all the way out Lakeshore Boulevard to that, what used to be Howard Johnson's by Grandma's house on Clifton and Lake Avenue. So I will take a video of that. I remember even as an 8-year-old child sitting in the car when my dad went to the window and bought us ice cream. Mom and I would come out the old road that was here before the freeway on the way to Lakewood to see the beautiful homes in Lakewood. And then this was like halfway. My dad would pull in and he'd park right over here, right where my red car is, right along this corner of the parking lot. I'm the second car in from the driveway. And right in that corner of the building there somewhere, I'll zoom in on it, and I don't see it, but I think it's probably where that door was. There was a little serving window where you just go up to the window and you could buy ice cream. He'd buy ice cream for us and bring it back to the car, and then we'd continue on to Lakewood, down Lake Avenue and Clifton. And my mother and my father would just look at the elegant homes there. And I suppose they probably had their own dreams about what kind of beautiful house they could buy. It's coincidental, though, because I lived on the east side, way out on East 124th Street. And here we are very close to Grandma's house that you guys know by West 85th Street. This is actually maybe around West 100th Street. You guys have seen this place many times. It was called Krosky's when Dad brought us here. Then became Howard Johnson's, and now I see that it's Don's Lighthouse Grill. Door that went underneath the porch. I made a fort in there, and I used Excelsior, which was shredded wood that was used as packing when Dad bought a new wash machine for Mom. I took all the Excelsior and lined my existing fort with Excelsior so I wouldn't have to sit on the ground. I used to use a candle for illumination in there. There was some ledges in there, and I'd put the candles up on the ledge. One day I dropped the candle, and it set the Excelsior on fire. And I got panicky, so I ran out, ran up the steps, and my mom and my dad were in the kitchen talking, and I went in there and I says, "Do you smell anything?" And they said no, and they continued talking. So I opened up the window, and I think the window wouldn't stay open, so I put a knife in it to hold it up, but I'm not sure. But anyway, I opened the window, and I says, "Don't you smell anything?" And they said no, and they kept on talking. So finally I said, "I think I smell a fire." And I can still remember to this day, my dad stopped talking, he looked at me, and suddenly realized what happened, and he said, "That little bastard set the house on fire." So he comes running out, and he sees the fire underneath the porch. He grabbed the Excelsior and pulled all the Excelsior out into the backyard, and the whole fire came out with it, and stomped it out, and the fire was over. And I don't remember if I got punished, but I deserved a very good spanking for that. This is St. Maron's Church on East 13th and Carnegie. This is where my dad went to the Maronite church for Mass. And when he got buried out of this church also. The funeral Mass was at this church. I remember these steps. I remember walking up these steps when I was still in the Holy Family home. And when Arlene and I were going to get married, we first talked to the pastor at this church because I thought I was in the Maronite rite. And it turns out I was baptized in the Roman rite, so I didn't have to get married here. So we wound up getting married at Arlene's church, St. Stephen's, which was Latin rite. That's the church. It's been a landmark in the city for I don't know how long. 1937, I was 6 years old, and I was at Health Hill for a couple months. Then I went back to East 124th Street. I only stayed there for about a year, and then moved to 1502 Lakeview Avenue when I was 7. And then about a year later, we moved to 1368 Lakeview and stayed there until my mom left for April 1st, 1941. And it was about 3 weeks later that we were put into the orphanages. When Mom left, Dad, I guess, really thought she ran off with someone else. And he got very despondent about it. And after we were in the orphanage, so it got to be June or July, he went to a bar in a building I think is still standing where they had the Glenville shootout. I'm going to try to photograph that building. He had a Lebanese friend that owned the bar, and he told the Lebanese friend when he catches the person that ran off with his wife, he's going to shoot him. And he pulled out a pistol. Dad was a gun collector, so he had quite a few, not quite a few, but he had some pistols, and he was really interested in guns. He pulled out this pistol, and his friend thought Dad is going to get himself into big trouble, so he called the police. The police arrested Dad, and when Dad was examined, a psychiatrist, I guess, decided Dad is mentally despondent and sent him to State Hospital, which is on State Road, or Turney Road, I guess Turney Road, State Hospital on Turney Road, for mentally ill people. And Dad stayed there the summer of 41. I don't know how many months. I'm going to guess between 3 months and 6 months. He stayed there and then was released from there. I think what happened is he sold the shop, that barber shop that was on East 124th in Auburndale, and opened up a new shop in Lakewood rather, on Madison Avenue. I think that shop's still standing, and I'm going to take a video of that shop later on. Here's the location of Cleveland Juvenile Detention Home. It's on 2209 Central Avenue. It's right across from St. Vincent's Hospital, and it's right along the shore, the I-90 freeway that goes through downtown Cleveland. It's very visible from the freeway. This side of the building was the main entrance when I went to it in 1941. It's a rectangular building, and inside is that courtyard I was talking about. I had a very unhappy experience, many unhappy experiences here, but one was when some kids started beating up on Larry, and Larry told him that he was going to tell his big brother on them. So the bigger boys laughed about it and said, well, we'll get your big brother too. So when I realized they were looking for me, I hid underneath the bed in the dormitory and nobody could find me. And then I heard a big ruckus in the day room where the kids play, and I finally realized it's my two brothers crying. They were being beaten up. So I came out from under the bed and went to the playroom to see if I could do something to help. And as I walked towards the playroom, here's a man in charge sitting by the desk right outside the door of the playroom reading the newspaper, totally unconcerned. And I walked in the playroom and a bunch of kids were beating up Larry and a bunch of kids were beating up Lenny, and Lenny was trying to climb up one of these windows, trying to climb up pulling on the window shades, trying to climb out of reach. I got so angry I took off my belt and wrapped it around my fist and started swinging the buckle, and I hit one kid in the finger and put a hole in his finger with my buckle. And then of course I got overpowered and all three of us got beaten up, and the guy who was in charge never moved from the desk. They just let us get beat up until the kids were tired of beating us up, and that was it. So those are some of my bitter memories of this place. I don't have any good memories of this place. It was set up for delinquents, but there's very poor supervision here. And as I look back on it now as an old man, the imbeciles that ran this place didn't know anything about how to hold families together and how to encourage kids to make the best of a bad situation. So that's my venom against this place. Fortunately, I only stayed here 6 weeks, and then I went to Holy Family Home. I had to stay in the infirmary for a week because I was sick. Larry and Betty had preceded me by 1 week and went to Holy Family Home. Well, here's my dad's old barber shop on Madison Avenue, 15618 Madison. This was the barber shop he went to after he left the barber shop at 1424 East 124th Street. So this was a pretty good neighborhood. Right here, when he had the barber shop, there was a miniature golf course. So I used to play miniature golf there quite a bit. I was here once before and I talked to the owner of this shop. He bought it from someone who probably was the person that bought it from my dad, but he let me in the shop and I was able to see the back room, and he told me some of the history of the shop. This is the front office. To the left is the main office of the nuns. That's where I sang that song, There Was a Little Ford. Maybe I'll tell that one a little bit later because it's kind of early yet. Over on this side, I believe, was a small office. Behind it was a chapel. And upstairs was the dormitory for the girls, and then the third floor was the dormitory for the boys. But I spent from 1941 to 1946 at the home, and my brothers and sisters spent a longer time. The home only accepted children that were in grade school. Nancy and Lenny were too young, they were only 3, so they went to a foster home for 2 years before they came to the home. Here's a nice photograph of all 5 of us when we were at Holy Family Home. That building in the background was the laundry room, and the caretaker used to stay in that house. The caretaker actually lived in his own house, but that was kind of like his workshop area. And all the laundry from the home was done in that house. Maybe that lady with the white coat on was the laundry lady. Right back in the background here, one time I had the adventure of my life at the home. There's a little swamp there in the spring, about 10 feet in diameter and 8 inches deep. And it was filled with mosquito larvae and frogs and little salamanders. I remember one Saturday morning I had planned to go back there and catch what I could. I couldn't wait to get up. Then I went back there and I spent the whole morning catching frogs and salamanders and little cans of mosquito larvae, and boy, it seemed like a big African safari. And by noon, you know, I was done catching everything I was going to catch. I also caught a nest full of baby goldfinches, and then I caught the mother by putting the goldfinches inside a bird cage and shutting the door with a string when the mother went in. They all died on me because they wouldn't eat in captivity. So I wrapped them up like mummies, put them in a mason jar, and pasted out a map like a pirate's map, where I walked back to where a fence is, and then I walked this direction so many steps, and then further back so many steps, and then buried them with a little cross. After I left Holy Family Home, I used to go back there and look at that cross, and then finally I never went back again. Of course, there's all homes built there, back there now, but that was another adventure in my life. Well, I'm standing on Rocky River Avenue across from where Holy Family Home used to be. That tree was undoubtedly here when I was here as an orphan. This place is not a cancer home anymore. It's the City Mission Laura's Home for Women and Children. Address 18120 Puritas, so that's the same address the orphanage had. This was the main driveway that went into the home, but the home was nowhere near this big. And on this side was Puritas Elementary School, which is completely gone. The orphanage used to belong to a rich family, and they had an orchard back here with a bunch of apple trees and quince trees. And then one of those trees is very close to the camera, maybe about halfway down of what you can see at the parking lot, is the tree I found a nest of baby goldfinches. Then the opening in the fence, they had a cyclone fence around here, and there was an opening in it right over there. And if I zoom in on it, that's where I started my pirate's treasure map, showing where I buried the sparrows. I remember another incident with Larry on the side entrance to the home, which of course is not here anymore, but it would have been right about here somewhere. Being a stupid little kid, I asked Larry to sit down on the porch, and I stuck a match in one of the eyelets in his shoe with the head in the shoe, and I lit the end of the match, and we both waited until the match ignited, and it burned his foot. I was dumb enough to think it was funny, but it didn't injure Larry, but it sure hurt. So Cheryl, even though Braden's a lot like his grandfather, he's an angel compared to his grandfather. Behind the fence where all those homes are, that's where Larry and Lenny and their friends built a baseball field. They made their own baseball mitts and made their own baseball, and I don't know where they got the bat from, but they played baseball here quite a bit. This was after I left the home. Holy Family Home had a number of structures. They had the laundry house that appeared on one of the photographs. They had a building we called the gym, and it had a wooden floor just like a gym would have. Then they had another little building over in here that they called the hospital. It was like a sick bay, and a real elderly nun used to take care of the sick kids in that hospital. This tree that I'm aiming at was standing here when the school was here. I remember a sewer next to it, and I remember seeing a frog down in the sewer, and I actually lifted the lid off the sewer and rescued the frog. This is St. Patrick's Church. I want to get close so I don't have too much glare. The church was elongated after I was in the home. The church ended just before the priest house. And I used to serve Mass in this church. Behind the priest house there was a little wooded area, a little grassy area that they hired me and another kid from the home to dig out so they could put in the foundation for a garage. As we dug it out, we found a lot of coins. And so I used to go down to a little drugstore to my left on Rocky River and buy pocketbooks. They were a nickel at that time. and I was always interested in books, so I bought a bunch of books I never read. Here's St. Patrick's grade school. It's run by St. Patrick's Church. This sign was never here. This is the first time I ever saw the sign. But this is the building. That was the main door we used to go in. And I went here for, it'd be like junior high, the 7th and 8th grade. I went to this school, and then from this school I went to Cathedral Latin. You'll see Chambers Funeral Home. This is where Mom was buried. I went to school with Bill Chambers, and I knew his brother, Dan Chambers. His brother died some 15 years ago. And I knew Chambers' father, who had a funeral home on the east side. And the Chambers family used to send me on errands to go to the father's home. And I used to always take this shortcut that I took now down this pathway, which goes behind the home. Well, here's that swimming pool, or I should say a wading pool. It's just about exactly the way it was when we were in the orphanage. We used to make a lot of picnics in the summer, maybe once or twice each summer, where we'd walk from the orphanage down Puritas Avenue to Puritas Springs Park by Grayton Road. Walked over to here, and then we usually sat at some picnic tables here, and we had sandwiches for lunch. And then we'd wade in this pool. I remember many times walking on my hands into that pool, and at 10 years old, I'd be up to my neck by the center where that fountain was, and it's much shallower, of course, towards the edge. And then if I got cold, I would lay on the concrete edge here and warm up and then go back in. So I have a lot of memories about this pool. Well, here's my first communion photograph, and it shows that it was taken at Uncle Carl's home on Mitchell. So I'm going to find Mitchell. It's very close to Attica, where I showed you on the map. I'll probably find it when I drive out there. There's Betty's first communion picture taken a year later in the same room. They had a real nice sunroom in that house. And then here's me in front of the house, next probably to Uncle Carl's car or my dad's car. And I'm aimed towards Aunt Helen and Uncle Carl's house. The address is 14602 Mitchell Avenue. It's right on the corner of another street, so I remember it being a corner lot. So this is the house. It's different than I remembered it. I remember the sunroom, and I think the sunroom is this room right in here. And that's where the photographs were taken of me and Betty inside the room next to Uncle Carl's desk. We used to come to Aunt Helen's house for Thanksgiving a lot, and I remember making snowmen on that lawn around by the corner there. And one time I walked all the way from the home to Aunt Helen's house. It was quite an adventure to get away from the home and be in somebody's house. I only stayed there for a while, then had to walk back again. Incidentally, this is a house Uncle Carl could have bought for a couple $1,000s during the Depression, and thought that that was a bad deal. The house would never hold that value. I bet this house now in this part of Cleveland is probably worth $150,000 to $200,000. Well, here's the side of the house, and that's the sunroom that I'm aimed at. And then she had a side entrance that we went into, I remember that. And she had a garage, I remember the garage. I don't remember the fence, I don't think they had a fence there. But we used to make snowmen on this lawn here. Even at Thanksgiving sometimes there was snow on the ground. This brick pavement is undoubtedly the original pavement that was here in the 40s. So this is where Aunt Helen lived when we were in Holy Family Home. And we visited this house frequently with Dad, and this is where our first communion photographs were taken. This is 8301 Detroit. This is what used to be St. Anthony's Home for Boys. If I zoom in here, you can see the address. Everything is different on this building. The whole front has been rebuilt, and it was converted for a while into an alcoholic's home. Now it is Bridgeway, whatever that is. It's like, I suppose it's some kind of institution for people who have problems. The roof is the original roof. This wing probably is the original wing. I remember a bunch of ivy vines covering the entire side of the house, and I used to shoot sparrows with my slingshot from those vines. This might be a new addition onto the front of the house. And the other side of the house, we had a real nice porch over there and a roof over it, and somebody flooded the shower up above it, and they rebuilt that porch. My dad's house on West 81st Street is right behind this wing, so this is 83rd. The very next building to the home is a terrace, and 1424 West 81st Street is in that terrace. Grandma Peter's house is behind me on West 85th Street, so you kids know this neighborhood very well. Here's the side of the home, and this is pretty much the way it was. That's the side door. That's a kind of construction there was on the side of the building. And somewhere along there they made the addition. There used to be two big stone railings like at the edge of the steps. The steps are all different now. And of course those railings would be hidden by the car. They were about 3 feet high. And I remember in my youth at the home, I used to be able to walk up to those railings and just hop right on top of them. I wouldn't dare try it now. That was the playroom of the home, the lower floor, and up above was the dormitory. And of course there was a basement in the home too. This building was the gym, and I played basketball in there many times. In the gym is where I got in a fist fight with that kid who probably broke and bent my nose for me. Either that or when I rode an orange up the ramp at the Terminal Tower, that's how I bent my nose. But I think that fist fight really did it. Back in here in the grass, we had a baseball diamond and a football field. And I used to play baseball occasionally. I was a pretty good pitcher. Because I could throw the ball pretty well, and I was always pitcher with the kids when the kids played baseball after I got married. And I used to play football a little too, touch tackle, and I was the quarterback, not because I was any good at calling plays, but I could throw the ball pretty good, and I usually threw the ball to the guy to catch it. There's a very funny or very interesting story about a tough guy that came to the home. He came from one of the East Side gangs. He was only 15 years old, pleasant-looking guy, a chubby stomach, kind of fat-looking. You would never think he was tough, but he wound up beating up everybody in the home except two guys. Betty met him once at a high school dance and thought he was very pleasant. He and I met him when I came home from the barber shop, and he and I started talking alone. And because we both came from the East Side, we became friends, so he never bothered me. But he beat up Ray Harris, and he beat up a kid named Billy Abraham, who was 100% muscle, 18 years old, very tough guy. And this Howie Michaels was the kind of guy that you couldn't hurt him hitting him in the stomach. He had all muscle in the stomach, even though it was fat. So he never protected his stomach, and every time Abraham would punch him in the stomach, he'd punch Abraham in the head. Finally, Abraham quit fighting. And so that was the talk of the home. There's only two guys Michaels didn't want to fight with. One was Creighton Tomick, who was just too strong, and Michaels knew it. And the other one was Max Moore, who was very strong, but had a really hot temper. So Michaels always said if he started to fight with Max Moore, he'd have to kill him because Max Moore never stopped fighting. Those are the only two guys Michaels didn't cower or beat up in a fight. Here's the building showing the barber shop on 52nd and Lorraine. My dad had the shop on the left-hand side of the building. The shop on the right-hand side was abandoned, and was used as storage area for chicken coops for Schulte Poultry Company. Schulte used to slaughter chickens in the building to the right on the photograph. That whole building where the barber shop is was filled with roaches, great big roaches over an inch long, plus small ones. We used to shoot them with BB guns, there were so many. Here's a photograph of my dad. This is my dad standing in front of the barber shop. He always bought old cars. I don't know if that's his car out in front, but this was on 52nd and Lorraine. Another photograph of my dad that is undoubtedly in front of the barber shop on 52nd and Lorraine. It even shows that other empty store. That empty store had a sign painted in the window that said hamburgers 5 cents. So even in 1950 we knew that had to be very old, because hamburgers cost more than 5 cents in 1950. You can see by that lamppost that that's the same lamppost that's in this photograph. So I think all three of these photographs were taken at the same time. Here's another photograph taken in front of the barber shop on 52nd and Lorraine. We're standing on Lorraine about where my dad was in the previous photographs. Betty obviously took this photograph. Here's another one facing in the other direction with Larry, Nancy, and Lenny, and that shows the barber pole in my dad's barber shop. The building behind was owned by a good friend of his that had a restaurant. Here's another one of me and Larry standing in front of the barber shop. My dad had the barber shop from about the time I started high school in 1950 until he retired in about 1962. Well, this is 5201 Lorraine Avenue. This is the building Dad's barber shop was in. I told you a new owner bought the building and renovated it, and he opened up the barber shop. There was a division between the barber shop and that closed down hamburger place. The door on the left was the door into the barber shop, and this was the barber shop. And the door on the right went to the old restaurant. Now both doors go inside the antique store. This part of Lorraine has been restored as a historic site of some sort. They've actually landscaped the sidewalks and they have it looking pretty nice, and they have a bunch of antique stores on it. Let's see if we see the address. Those are probably the original doors. This was the barber shop and this was the restaurant. Let's see if I can zoom in on the address. 5201. Well, here's another view of the barber shop. This, boy, I remember these windows very well. I used to wash these windows after school. The photographs we took, I'm across the street now, so I'm further away than we were in the camera. But right about where that lady's walking into the store, that's where we were standing, and I was probably, whoever took the picture was standing right at the edge of that brick column, and then took the photographs. The lamppost is gone. That old-fashioned lamppost is gone. But here's the building that was across the street, and it's still there. The building with the chimneys on it, that's the same building that was in the background of the photographs. I remember V. Miller's dry cleaning store very well. When I was in high school, somebody crashed into the front of the store, and the store was rebuilt. It's still, I suppose, owned by the same people. Right next to it is a closed down store that used to be a little photography shop. And I used to buy all my photographic equipment from there, and I actually bought that movie camera I used for all the home movies I bought there. And I used to have all my pictures developed, all my movie films developed at that store. This is the side of the barber shop. There was a division wall right about here, about where that window is, behind the tree. And this was part of Schulte's storage area for chicken coops. This was Schulte's loading dock for chickens. And then they'd bring the chickens in, and in this building, Schulte would slaughter the chickens and then prepare meats. And he was a real famous poultry and meat supplier in the 50s and 60s and earlier. It later on became a fish market, and now I think it's closed. There's kind of a funny story about this, because Dad used to park right over here. He always parked right on this corner down here to try to get the sunlight out of the camera. One time he came home and he told me there was some kind of funny squeak in the car, and he asked me to go check the car out. And here there was a chicken that got inside his wheel well. So I told him it was a chicken. He says, well, why don't you take him downstairs and kill him and we'll eat him? So dumb me, I took the chicken downstairs, hung him up in the laundry room by his feet, slit his throat. He started flapping his wings and spread blood all over the entire walls and me, and just made a horrible mess. I spent all day cleaning that chicken, pulling the feathers off, and that was the last chicken I ever tried to slaughter myself. But we did eat it. Here's the spot where Cathedral Latin once stood. On East 107th Street, between Euclid and Carnegie. Carnegie's behind me. Euclid is in front of me. The whole school is torn down. This is now part of Cleveland. Well, it's part of Cleveland Clinic. That's Cleveland Foot and Ankle Care Clinic. But it's part of Cleveland Clinic. Cleveland Clinic was a famous hospital when I was in high school, but there were several blocks down the street. They have just grown and spread, and they finally took the block where Cathedral Latin was. As a coincidence, Arlene went to summer school one year when she was in West Tech. Right across the street, here's the front steps to John Hay High School. That's undoubtedly where she entered the school. This is the high school here. And this is also owned by Cleveland Clinic. So here's a sign, John Hay High School, Cleveland Clinic Foundation, and then some notice about the classes that meet here. So this is where Mom and I, when we did not know each other, we both wound up in schools across the street from each other. While I was at St. Anthony's Home, and when I was going to Cathedral Latin, I had my third job as a carry-out boy and packer of food bags at Fisher Foods, which was on Lorraine Avenue and about West 110th Street. But that building's tore down. There used to be a big Sears Roebuck company there, and Fisher's was part of that big building complex. You can see where Route 90 is, Berea Road, Madison Avenue, 10 is Lorraine Avenue, and this is West Boulevard, this street here. So this is where Fisher Foods was. Well, I'm looking at the intersection of Lorraine right in front of me where that truck went, and 110th Street, about where that man is. That telephone post says 110th and Lorraine. And if we look down here, this is where Sears was, and Fisher Food Company, and a couple other stores are built in here. It's all tore down, and it's all a new little shopping complex. But Fisher's, I don't remember exactly where, but I think it was right about in here. Here's the house where we used to live at, I think it was 1946 West 50th Street. It's on the corner of West 50th and Duke. The owners lived on the first floor. I think they might have rented out the second floor, and my dad and I and Betty lived on the third floor. You could see the peak up on the top there, and that was, I think, one of our bedrooms. Here's the side of the house. I'm on Duke now. That bottom door was the door we entered, and then we went up that stairway up to the top floor. We lived on the third floor. And I think that window on the rear was one of the windows to our section. Here's the rear of the house, and I guess you can see that there's 3 stories. We were on the top story, so that very top window was like our kitchen window. And there used to be another tree in the yard there, and I was quite the taxidermist at the time. I lived here when I stuffed that chipmunk to make a bookend. I'm not chipmunk, hamster, to make the bookend. I asked Betty once to hold the window open while I tried to shoot a bird in the tree. And when she was trying to hold the window open, I think she propped it up with a pop bottle. And the pop bottle slipped out, the window fell down on her finger and broke her finger. So that was something I never heard the end of. To make it worse, I missed the bird, so we didn't get anything out of it. There's a funny story about Betty and Ray Harris. They had a date when I was working nights at Glidden Company, and Betty and Ray come walking down this street towards me, towards Duke, and Dad was waiting for him because Betty was late. So he went out and intercepted him on the sidewalk and started raising Cain with Ray for keeping Betty out so late, and it got Betty terribly embarrassed in front of all the neighbors. So she started sassing Dad back, and Ray's trying to calm my dad down, and he's trying to calm Betty down. He says, "Betty, this is your father, he's worried about you," etc., etc. Ray was a real nice gentleman about the whole thing, but Betty was furious. And then when I got home from work, of course, Dad was in the house. He was already sheepish. And Betty says, "Ask your father what he did." So I asked him, and then between my dad and Betty, I got the story. So I bawled Dad out, believe it or not. And Dad felt like maybe he overreacted. So it turned out to be a funny story, and Ray Harris used to tell me about it many times after that. He never had any hard feelings about it. He thought it was funny. Well, here's the old Glidden Paint Company where I used to work. It had two buildings. This building is right on the intersection of Madison and Berea. So this is Berea Road. That's Madison over there by that other building. This was Glidden's headquarter building, and that's the building I worked in. I worked on the third floor mixing paint. Then they had a varnish department back over in this building. The cafeteria was in this building. I used to mix varnishes as well. Main thing I did though was mix paint. One time I was mixing paint in a 1,000-gallon mixer. There was a horizontal grinding mill. Put in all the pigments and varnishes and everything, and forgot to put the lid on the mill. And when we started the mill up, everything fell out, including the grinding stones. It was one horrible mess. West 89th Street, there was a 4-unit apartment. It was named Clara, and the address was 2006 Clara. This porch was our porch, so we were on the lower left-hand unit. The owner lived in the building, and he was a guy from Europe, very fussy. He came down one time because Larry or somebody, Betty, was slamming the refrigerator door too loud. So he came down and came in our house and actually demonstrated to us how to shut the refrigerator door. So we never really liked having a landlord. But I lived in this house until I went to the Air Force. That movie I saw, Blanche Fury, I think had Elizabeth Taylor in it. It was at the Madison Theater. It's only at 91st and Madison, 2 blocks away on the north side of the street. This is on the south side of the street, but the theater's tore down. There's nothing there. Well, that's it.
Hello, Sonny. Thank you for making this movie. It was very good. I had a good life. I had 5 wonderful children, and I have a wonderful family. Thank you too much, and happy birthday on your 84th. I love you. Goodbye.